Good evening, everybody. It's great to see a whole lot of your faces coming up on the screen. I'm not a high-tech guy, but I really am impressed. And Maury, thank you very much for sorting this all out tonight. Without you, we would have been lost. And also the input that you make to EAA. Thank you so much. And just before we get started, one of my old mentors pitched up here on the screen, Toby Odelar. Toby, if you're hearing this, it's nice to see you again, and thank you for all the good times. So let's get going, and I think that where we start off with is Karl learning to fly on course of 162 at Central Flying School at Donata, and that's where the foundation was laid for so many of us. Karl was 2 years ahead of me on that. Some might say, I think a very, very well-known course, because apart from turning out some wonderful pilots, it was not without a certain amount of tragedy along the way. So, Karl, if you could start off, please, with telling us what it was like learning to fly at Donata in 1962.
What a pleasure to be here, and also to be under the baton of Scully Levine. And when I said that Maury inferred that he was the best known pilot, he's the most famous pilot in South Africa, and probably one of the most experienced as well, who is still flying. Learning to fly at CFS, man, it was a grueling, really a grueling 9 months that we spent there. And I just want to say to anybody out there, we're so fortunate to have done that. And what the Air Force taught us was to fly properly. And the discipline that was instilled in us, and it still works to this day. And what they taught you in the Air Force, you could fly, if you could fly a Harvard as a 17-year-old, you can fly a 747 as a 40-year-old. And it's thanks to the Air Force for that wonderful training. We had a couple of really, they were bullies, but nowadays not the way that we are taught to fly or taught things by CRM methods. And if you had done something wrong during your lesson, you would be told to go and to the AGA beacon. It was actually the echo beacon, but in the local lingo, it was AGA. And that was called a voice rotating beacon. And if you got lost in the CFS flying area, you'd climb up 12,000 feet or so, and you turn on E-echo. That was AGA. And you would hear this voice, or just a loud buzz, and they would say 26, and oh, and it eventually turn around and go 26, and so you turn on to 260, and you fly and fly and fly, and sure enough, there would be CFS. But if you were with your instructor and you did something wrong, that guy would make you go and take tea to the lady in the box. They actually called it the Hurandi box. And you had to run down there with the tea and find her, but she's not there because it's a box, it's a machine, big thing. And walk around it, and you'd come back with the tea, or if you had poured the tea out, they said, did you give it to her? And you say, yes, you were lying. Then you'd have to go back again. And so it would be, or they'd make you, if you didn't have tea, you'd carry the instructor put his parachute over his shoulder, and the pupil pilot had to carry the parachute, which was also your seat, a big thing, and also your bone dome under the other arm. And you'd have to run down there. And if you were there and back too quickly, they'd say, oh, you're keen, you can do it again. If you were too slow, they'd say, make you go and do it again. So anyway, that was just one of the quirks of CFS, but I'm very thankful to have endured it.
If I remember correctly, there were 5 major disciplines that you were taught. You were taught general flying, which was aerobatics and spinning and the general handling of the aeroplane. You were taught navigation, night flying, instrument flying, and formation flying. Those were the 5 major disciplines, and 200 hours. Along the way, whilst there was a formation sortie or formation lesson that was taking place, there were a number of formations that were out in the general flying area, and there was the most unusual accident ever. And could you tell all the participants here tonight what happened there?
Yeah, there was a dreadful mid-air collision. And the chap who was that spun into the formation was a fellow called Mike Copeland, and he had Johan Berger with him. And they were spinning under the hood and, of course, doing instruction. And when they recovered, there was a formation in front of them, and they mushed into the leader. And their airplane blew up, and it ejected Mike Copeland and Berger. And Mike Copeland managed to survive, and he pulled his chute, and Berger came out, and he didn't make it. But in the other 2 airplanes were guys who were well known around our parts, was Arie de Klerk and Jeff Earl. And it'll be interesting to speak to them about this. It was a dreadful thing. I happened to be flying dual at the time, and the instructor said to me, "Look at that." Couldn't see anything, but there was this puff in the sky. And I suppose it was about 10 miles from us, but we didn't go to the site there. A real tragedy. In fact, I think there were 12 pupils, fellow pupils that died on that course.
That was a great shame, but very, very lucky that Jeff wasn't, that the aeroplane never collided with either Jeff's aeroplane or with Arie's aeroplane. Then at the end of the year, you got your wings, and some guys went off to fly transport airplanes, some to helicopters, some went straight to jets. And you, to my knowledge, you were earmarked for jets, but not before doing a stint as a station pilot. So leading up to going on, to becoming a jet jock, tell us more about being a station pilot.
Okay, I was posted to SWAT Corps, and they didn't have any work for us, but so you were known as a station pilot, but also as the Stasi Slet. Sorry, but anyway, and the Stasi Slet was there to do maintenance flights or post-maintenance test flights, compass swings, ferries, and whatever they wanted us to do. And while I was there, we also went on Toby Odlar was involved in this lot. I went on a vampire technical course, and the station flight, from station flight, I was transferred to Langebaan, where we did a weapons course in preparation to fly vampires and then sabres and mirages, which Toby Odlar was able to do. But that was...
If I can remember correctly, Toby was one of the lucky guys, not without the ability, I might add, but he went vampires, sabres, and then eventually ended up on Canberras. And his skill speciality there was high altitude photography, and he did a hell of a lot of mapping of the northern parts of South Africa, of Namibia, and of Angola. And you would have 10 to 1 followed exactly the same path as he had followed, had not cruel fate intervened. And can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you remember we were on this massive pupil pilots course, the biggest one post-war. And that was because the conflagration was building in Southwest Africa, Angola. And my father was involved in politics, which led to him being banned. And I was the most apolitical animal that you could ever imagine. And because he was banned, I was summarily summoned, and Dennis Earp called me to his office when I was at Langebaan, and he showed me a signal, as they called it, and said, "What is this about? Why have I resigned?" I said, "I haven't resigned." So he said, "Here is a notice that says you are to be off the station within 24 hours. And that was the end of my career. And Dennis Earp personally put me on a deck in a co-pilot seat and flew me down to Cape Town. And they gave me about half an hour to collect all my kit. And in Cape Town, got out of the deck. He actually, I still so remember it, because Dennis Earp was so upset, and I was too young to really understand what was going on. It was dreadfully, dreadfully unfair. And it's something that I hold against those people that did this to me to this day. Anyway, at Cape Town, got onto a C-130, and the C-130s weren't even painted yet. They were shiny silver, not as shiny as my 170. They delivered me to Waterkloof, and they put me in a 47 Fleetline Ford car, took me home, and my parents lived opposite the Union Buildings in an apartment. And they stopped, he said, "Is this the place?" And I said, "Yep." And he said, "8." And he got out, took my kit bag out the back of the car, threw it on the sidewalk, turned around, slammed the door, and drove off. That was the end of my career.
Oh,
and about a week later, I got the form, which I actually tore out of my logbook. I'm sorry, I never kept it.
Very, very sad story. But nevertheless, knowing you put your best foot forward, and you got going, and you started getting involved in civilian flying your first Pipers and Cessnas, etc., etc., etc. So tell us a little bit about where you. Sorry, it won't be a little bit, but tell us. Tell us something about your start in general aviation, civilian general aviation.
Okay. From my grandmother had 110 Rand in the post office, my post office book. She gave it to me. And 110 Rand bought me 21 hours in Piper Cub from the Pretoria Flying Club, or various Piper Cubs. And I used to cycle there from the Union Buildings on my bicycle to go and fly the club. And eventually, when I got the hours, I hired a Cessna 172 from Brits and did my commercial pilot's test. We didn't have to write again. I had to write air law. And I was tested by Major Pidsley, Bomb Pidsley, and got my comm license. From there, now I didn't have a job, and I went to the first one that was organized for me by a well-known guy called Monty Malherbe. Jix, the toy shop, was with Boerbaas cultivators in Heidelberg. They had a brand new 172, blue and silver thing. Eee, what a beautiful airplane. But I had to become a farm implement smose and a salesman. I knew nothing about that, absolutely nothing. So that I went for an interview with these guys. I said, "Ja, ek kan môre begin," and it wasn't for me. And these guys at Jix organized a post at Drakensberg Gardens Hotel. It was called the Dragon Flying Company, flying a tripacer. So at the magnificent sum of 236 hours, I caught a train to Pietermaritzburg. They came and fetched me in this beautiful tripacer, and I had a career. My career started doing flips around.
You were flipping people out of Drakensberg Gardens and up and around the Drakensberg in that hostile territory, up in a tripacer. Those days, before they started modding them, they had 135 horsepower engines. The 150 and 160 horsepower engines had yet to emerge. So on 135 horses, this is what you were doing.
No, ours had 150 horse CFD.
Right.
And flying out of that place at 5,500 feet, this dirt strip with trees at the end of the runway. And I used to fly it 4 up out of there. I was a little lighter than I am now, but still, with 4 adults in the airplane, The regular route was off Drac Gardens, over Bamboo Mountain, Sani Pass Hotel, and then over Sani Pass along the top of the berg, all at full bore to be able to stay in the air. And the timing was done on the tachometer of the airplane, 30-minute flips. And I often used to have to cut the engine and do dead stick landings. When I think about it now, I did lots of dumb things, and fortunately there was an angel, guardian angel on my shoulder, and I managed to survive that, not hurt anybody, and not break any airplanes.
Oh, that's fantastic. And how did you work your way down eventually to the Durban Wings Club, or down to Durban, Virginia?
To fly down there, or you mean as a job?
No, to end up working down there.
Oh, okay. After Drac Gardens, or while I was at Drakensberg Gardens, I also used to do instruction. I did an instructor's rating. And I used to do instruction at Escort Flying Club, and the 6 farmers who owned the Tri-Pacer. And I kept brushing them up all the time. And that was for about 2 years. And then I went to, when I had 1,000 hours total, I was employed by NAC at Swazi Air. Theo Truter was my boss. And so I started off in Swazi Air. And I arrived there in the afternoon of the appointed day, and I immediately had to go and do a conversion on a Vagabond to be able to instruct at the flying club. And as the sun was setting, I did 3 circuits with Theo Truter in a Navian Rangemaster. That was a big airplane, fuel injection, never heard of it. And it had hydraulics, never heard of it. And it had a generator. Anyway, did 3 circuits, and he said, okay, go and do 3 on your own. Did 3, and they filled it up. And the next morning, I had to take a patient who'd had a kidney removed to Jan Smuts Airport. Anyway, took off there with this guy prone in the seat next to me, across on a stretcher. And I flew along, and this aeroplane was just getting heavier and heavier and heavier, because that thing's got tip tanks. That airplane's still at Krugersdorp, Charlie Alpha Victor. And then suddenly, whoa, the engine would quit. Fuel cock, change the bloody fuel cock. Yoing, yoing, and the engine would take again. And of course, over rear bond, but the SAF taught us, if with a constant speed drop, you throttle back. Anyway, it didn't stop, and going again. And as we got closer to Jan Smuts Airport, the radio was getting softer and softer, and eventually there was no radio. But now I'm flying with one tank full, the other one empty, cross controls, holding this damn thing, battling. And so I fly over the airport, and I look at the signal square, and I see, the windsock is about on the long runway. So I do left-hand downwind, and I come in and land and have an engine cut, a rich cut on short finals. Anyway, land, taxi to the side, or let the thing run to the side of the road, and I jumped out, and I actually grabbed it by the fin and the skid, and I pushed it off the runway. And of course, there was I still remember there was a DC-7 and a Viscount. And they purposely came low over me. Well, I didn't know why, what I'd done wrong. I was on the runway. Boom, and then meow, the one over me. And they came along with a little Land Rover thing from the fire department with a rope, put it on the nose gear, and they pulled me to the terminal. The worst thing, well, had other things that happened as well, but that was just, I think, because I was not familiar or totally familiar with the aircraft. Nowadays, you learn the systems of the aircraft, and as we had this wonderful training in EAA, you knew that airplane backwards before you even saw it. Didn't exist then.
Also from there and those adventures, you went off to Durban.
Yeah, that was in Swazi Air. Now, Swazi Air was owned by National Airways, by Dickie Dunn, Basil Hersoff, those nice guys. And I managed to get a transfer to Durban, to Virginia. And because of having lived in Swaziland for 9 months, I was often quite often sent up there in an Air Commander to do the weekend schedule, which is from Durban Airport, Louis Botha Airport then, to Motapa, stay overnight with friends there, and then on Saturday morning, I'd go down to Lorenzo Marx, Maputo. It was about a 25-minute flight. Never carried any passengers, except occasionally, well, when I say never, hardly ever carried passengers. But the only passengers I ever carried there were hookers from Swaziland that were operating in
How lucky can you get? Yeah, how lucky can you get?
Yeah, but not easy on the eye. Eh? I mean, these were bloody industrial machines. And sitting Lorenzo Marx at the Polana Hotel for the whole day, and at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, back to Motapa, and Motapa back to Durban.
When you were in Durban, that's when I met you. I was giving part-time instruction as a civilian in northern Natal, and I had a grade 3 instructor's rating, so I couldn't send guys solo, and I couldn't do their private pilot license tests. So I would bring them down to Durban, Virginia, and look for an instructor, and that's where I found you. And Karl, I must say, you were a very warm and affable fellow. You put my students at ease. You had you never had a chip on your shoulder, or you felt very secure in yourself. And you were just a hell of a nice guy to deal with. You put my students at their ease, and I never had a single failure. You know, they fly them down over there, and you do the test for them, and they'd come away with a private pilot's license or whatever. So thank you for that. And that friendship has endured now for 53 years. It's 53 years since those days.
I'm grateful for that, but thanks very much for that, Scully.
So from there, while you were there, you brushed shoulders with some legendary characters. And the one that comes to, the 2 or 3 that come to mind are Nick Turvey, who very few people know about him today, but in our day, he was an incredible fellow. There was Mike van Ginkel, Vicky Rotenbach, and a couple of other guys. Can you tell us about some of the characters that you flew with?
You know, of those characters, if you think of what Nick Turvey's ability, I think he was national aerobatic champion about 11 times.
Eight times.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
that's considerable. That is considerable in anybody's book.
Absolutely. And he was flying a Zlin 526. And if you compare that to what, if he had the equipment that you guys fly nowadays of, you know, what kind of pilot he was a good pilot, but what he would have been capable of. And he actually showed me, flew with him a few times eventually when I moved up to Joburg. And I found that aerobatics were not actually for me when they'd done the way that Nick did with things like Lomshavaks. And for me, and a role is a thing that is gentle, it's music, it's ballet, but not with him. Anyway, and there was Mike van Ginkel. Eventually they employed my wife, and Picky Rotenbach. There were 3 guys in the Air Force there. Tinky Jones, his name was Dirty Potgieter, and Picky Rotenbach. Picky was a short guy, and he built a Druin Turbulent with a Foxy engine. And while he was building this at his home in Durban North, he didn't have air conditioning. Picky Rotenbach was a crop sprayer, nice guy, very fond of him. And his garage door, he had the sheeting off a regular house door, and tied to a cam on a little motor, a little electric motor. And this thing would go up and down, ventilating the garage. And as it went down, it blew all the shavings and the filings out of the hangar, and when the door came up again, all the filings came back in as well. Hell, was something to see. And also attached to this motor was an airplane tire, a 600 by 6 tire, that was running on a spool filled with agates and tiger's eyes, semi-precious stones in some sort of paste. And as long as I knew Picky Rotenbach, that thing was always tumbling, and he used to produce the most beautiful semi-precious stones. Another terrific guy that I also had a lot to do with in later life was Zingy Harrison. I actually bought a property next to his home down at Shelley Beach when I was still, way back when my kids were, still peanuts. There were also people from the Aero Club, because Durban was a very active aviation community, and Graham Wolfe, who I know, he was very fond of you as well. He was the chairman of the Aero Club of South Africa when the Aero Club was in a wood panel building down in downtown Joburg, and he was followed. The one who took over from him, I think, was Robbie Robinson, who had a paint business, specialized industrial finishes. Both of them happened to have air commanders that we flew, used to hire from them with NAC charters. It was a very happy time of my life. That it was very carefree, and got an instrument rating, and had terrific instruction there. And I also gave instruction on all kinds of planes.
It was a wonderful environment. It really was. The people were can-do. They were very proactive, and there were a lot of, they called it the state president's air race in those days. There were a lot of races that started there, lots of competitions, aerobatic competitions, and of course, an air show to die for. That was the longest running air show basically in history. It went for years and years and years and years until someone put a stop to it. But it's certainly a wonderful flying environment. And from there, you moved to South African Airways.
Yeah, can I just interrupt there, Scully? You were talking about, it was a Governor General's air race in those days.
Governor General's, yes. Governor General, then it became the state president's race, and now it's got a different...
I won in 1968 with Vernon McWilliams, Vern McRubbish. And
I never knew that.
Yeah, it was purely because of local knowledge from charter, that you knew which side of the mountain to go, and it was the time of the year was pretty windy. So you go on the correct side of the mountain, you are sitting in an updraft and flying in a Mooney, and it gets to the red line so easily.
Yeah.
And so we actually made up a couple of miles an hour on our handicap. And it worked well,
Until Chester got the better of you, hey? I mean, once you'd won a race, then your handicap shot up a couple of knots.
Yes.
Karl, so after Durban, Virginia, you were accepted by South African Airways, and you moved up there with a commercial pilot's license and about 3,000 hours. And went straight to Viscounts.
Yeah. There were 14 of us on the intake one April Fool's Day 1968. 2 of us that had flown twins and had instrument rating, myself and John Thompson, who'd flown DAX. So they put us straight onto Viscounts. Wow, you got a handful of throttles and beautiful aeroplane. And the rest of the guys had to become second officers. I think a very derogatory calling them boy pilots, but that's what they were called. The rest became boy pilots for about a year before they moved on to Viscount or to whatever aircraft, internal, domestic aircraft. That was a great good fortune. And learning about the Viscount, the first time I'd been in a turbine-driven airplane, and it was a very complex machine and a lovely, lovely airplane to fly. But a bit of a ground gripper. That was from our geography, I'd never believed that the Earth was round, but that's the only way the Viscount got airborne. No, it was a beautiful airplane and very popular with the passengers, and it had these big oval panoramic windows. It was very quiet inside and very noisy in the front. And to this day, my hearing is not probably as sharp as yours. But after landing, you would pressurize the aircraft to 200 feet below airfield level with a QNH and all that adjusted. So when you touch down and you turn off the runway, the captain would open his side window to allow for the total depressurization of the airplane. Otherwise, you would have a slight pressure on the doors and you wouldn't be able to open them. So you had to depressurize it. So it's on the ground and it would do it slowly, and he would just check that it's depressurized before we taxied. And that noise of the root blowers on those Rolls-Royce Dart engines was it was so intense, and I'm sure that is initially damaged my ears, but it's okay. The compensation for being able to fly those beautiful airplanes for the rest of my life was, I will never look back on that with any.
But nothing was as beautiful as the next aeroplane you were to fly, and that was the Boeing 727.
Wait a bit, we'll show you one here quickly. There we go. There at Durban. Now, Scully, I'd like to just say something about that airplane. When you fly that had two pilots and a flight engineer. That's the first time I'd been in a multi-crew, when I say, well, more than a captain and a co-pilot. And the side-facing oiler, the flight engineer, he would sit there with and handle the throttles or the thrust levers, not during takeoff and land, well, on takeoff, and also pressurization and all the systems. And on takeoff in that airplane, it would push you back, and it was absolutely delicious. There was not a sound in the cockpit, nothing. All the sound was behind you. And because that airplane had the engines all inboard on the fuselage, the wings were very strong but very flexible. So it gave you such a pleasant ride, and the airplane performed like a rocket ship. It was the most beautiful airplane to fly, but also difficult because of the position of the undercarriage so far back.
Karl, if you could just move your head to the side so that the people, okay, now that way, now keep it there. Okay, everybody, have a look at where those wheels are, right back, far, long way from the cockpit. Okay, you can come up for air. Thank you. Okay, so now when you see how far back those wheels are, if you left the rotation even a second too late, and you pull back on the stick to arrest the sink for the landing, you would bash those wheels into the ground like you can't believe, and then oxygen masks would come flying out of the roof after measuring between 9 and 11 on the Richter scale. So it was an aeroplane that was very difficult to land, but you could also grease it on, and then it flattered you the way you could actually grease it on. And Karl, there was nothing to catch that thing on the descent, eh?
No, but I think we descended at 280 knots, eh?
That was tame. It was red-lined. It was red-lined at 380 knots.
Yeah.
380 knots at sea level, 411 knots at 23,500 feet. So it went like hell.
Beautiful airplane.
But could you contain all of that speed eventually?
Yeah, but as a co-pilot, I tried not to do anything wrong and not to annoy the guard next to me on the left.
You never flew with Toby Odelar, you see. So he would have shown you. He would have shown you. And you know, he was one of my mentors. And on one occasion, he said to me, "You know, you fly like a master." Oh, I was so chuffed. And then he said, "A station master." and I've never forgotten that. So, but I do remember that it had an incredible speed brake, and you could enter the circuit at 300 plus knots, pull the speed brake, and still undershoot.
That airplane, when I remember when Ed Kostenbader flew the thing into Joburg, and they taxied in with the flaps at full flap, 40 flaps, leading edge devices out, which to people who don't know about airplanes, it looks damn ugly. But to show the engineering that went into it, because this 727 was designed for short fields, so it could go into places where a DAC could basically operate in and out of. And it was just fabulous. And incidentally, we were one of the few airlines that operated 727. That was a Dash 100 model. They were actually called 144s in the airline. And then they came out with a 200, which is stretched. But the people that flew them, they said those were like a lead sled compared to
the 200 series. No one had the enthusiasm for those aeroplanes that we had for the 100 series. You're quite right. This was the pocket rocket. This was the, I often say, I say to people, there are those that flew the Boeing 727, and then there are the rest.
A great truth there. I spent 18 months on those airplanes as a co-pilot. It was just absolutely happy time.
And then from there, you went to the Boeing 707, four engines, and that was the aeroplane that heralded in the jet age, not so?
Yeah. 707, it was an absolute honor, because if you were in the airline, you became a senior first officer. You could only go onto the international routes if you had an ALTP. Or senior com. But I had about 4,000 hours at that stage, so it's doing the senior com. And I passed it first time except Nav General. Oh, man. Anyway, eventually they smashed down the walls of the classroom and let me out, and they signed me off having passed the ALTP. It was, I only spent 14 months on the 707. And by then, that was the biggest airplane in the airline. And we flew with guys who were known as the royal family. And they called them the royal family because they'd never been co-pilots. So what they said was law. Whether it was right or wrong, it was law. And, you know, if the guy bashed it into the ground, you'd say, "It's rather gusty today, isn't it, sir?" So if I want your advice. Anyway. And it was actually a very difficult time for us young guys, because they were a complete generation older than us, and CRM hadn't come about, which eventually was the culmination of the two 747s colliding at Los Rodeos in Tenerife. And they said that the airplanes are mechanically totally sound. The crew are trained. Why does this happen? But it was human performance and human behavior. And also having the royal family type individuals who everything was just absolutely right, what they said, regardless of whether it was correct or not. And the CRM, which I've been a big advocate of, as the people in EAA will know, is the way to go about life, not only flying, but about life. And use your resources, be gentle on people. You get the best out of people if you're gentle on them. And Scully, what you said way back there on when I was instructing, I was a nice guy then. not anymore. To hell with CRM. No. But we also had flight engineers and navigators on the 707. So here comes these young whippersnappers, a kid of about, I think I was about 28 years old, and I'm flying as a co-pilot on this thing. And we've got navigators from World War II days and a captain from World War II, maybe even World War I. These guys didn't like these young whippersnappers around, and you just sit there on tenterhooks all the time. It was I found it rather unpleasant. And I could not believe that an airplane could stay in the air for 11 hours, when the longest flight I'd ever done until then was 5 hours and 20 minutes in a Baron from Virginia to Sukhoma in Malawi. And 11 hours takeoff from Joburg and you fly to Las Palmas. I could not believe that you could fly so long.
No. I remember those guys well. You know, they. I remember them wearing their campaign medals. They were all war heroes, those guys. You know, and as you say, if you were, and you were never a third pilot, second officer, boy pilot. That's what you actually were, a boy pilot. And anything you wanted to ask the captain, you had to direct the query via the co-pilot. I mean, we were terrified of those guys.
I was a co-pilot on the 70. And even then, sometimes you had to direct it through the flight engineer or through the navigator to the captain.
Yeah. But what I remember most about that aeroplane, I remember how flexible it was. There was so much. It wasn't play, but you could bend the wings up. They said in heavy turbulence, the wingtips used to flap through an arc of about 8 foot, and you could 8 foot. That's just over 2 meters, and you could bend them up 23 or 24 feet to destruction. So when you went into severe turbulence, the wings were flapping around, but what was more disconcerting for me was the up and down movement of the fuselage. That was flapping around as well. And when you were up front, right up in the front, I recall experiencing eyeball bounce. And if you could just tell everybody that's watching and listening this evening what eyeball bounce is all about.
Eyeball, your eyes can focus, you're looking at everything upside down, so everything's been processed. And when it gets to, eyeball bounce takes place when you get to 4 hertz, 4 cycles per second of turbulence. And if it is of enough deviation, your eyes can't focus and everything becomes a blur. You can't read the instruments. And in a case like that, all you would do is, in that severe turbulence, which people think that you're getting away from the clouds, you get air masses mixing and jet streams mixing. The turbulence can be so severe, it could actually break the airplane. So you'd come back to, I don't remember the 707, I think it was about Mach 0.76 was the turbulence penetration speed of 280 knots. And that would, all you would do is just maintain the attitude as best you can, and it would go up and down with the turbulence. And not a pleasant sensation, but if you were aware of it, you would know how to control it. And in later years on the 747, it even had a turbulence mode. So if you on the auto flight system, so when you selected turbulence, it would cut the control movements down to half rate, and it would just maintain an attitude. So it wouldn't maintain altitude, it would maintain the attitude. Quite a phenomenon.
Karl, so you have flown at this stage of the game 2 of the very great Boeings. You'd flown the 727, you'd flown the 707, and then round about 1972, we got the first 747s. and you went on to the 747 as a co-pilot. And once you were there, you noticed that there were some terrific improvements over the predecessors. Could you tell us a little bit about the 747?
Okay. The 707, for a start, didn't have an APU. So when you wanted to start it, it had a bottle that you would be able to start an engine, a compressed air bottle. And now you go into the 747, which is exactly double the size. All the figures of the 707, you could apply in pounds, you could apply kilograms on the 747. The 707, about the same height as it had the same fuselage, or the 727 had the same fuselage as the 707. But now in the 747, you were sitting there and your eyeball height was 36 feet above the ground, which is, that's nearly 4 stories above the ground. It was so enormous, this airplane, but it's one airplane that has never become smaller. When you've flown an airplane plenty, it actually gets smaller or as you get more familiar with it. But that 747 was without doubt, the most wonderful airplane that has ever been made. I wish Joe Sutter was around to hear me talking about it. I so loved that airplane, and I flew the 747 for 4.5 years as a co-pilot. Now, you'd got the navigator had gone, so you've got INS. But because the World War, the royal family, they didn't trust the new INS, so it still had a sextant port in the roof, so where they could put a sextant through and wandering star and navigate that way, which is in 747s up, or to those that are still operating today, which is now used as an emergency smoke evacuation port. You pull a handle in it, opens a hole which is about that size, and it sucks all the air and all the stuff off the floor, and the stompies out, the ashtrays, all goes up through that hole if you open it. An amazing phenomenon, but very easy to fly and very difficult to fly accurately, which is, of course, is what we try to do all the time.
When you say that everything was doubled, if I can remember correctly, the fuel load alone was the same as the weight of a 707 fully laden with fuel and with passengers. It was a monstrous aeroplane. How did you control your speed or on the ground when you were taxiing away?
Well, it was very hard to judge. If you were riding in a mini minor or sports car, it looks like you're going like smoke. But in that airplane, because of your 36-foot height, you had to look at the INS to give you an accurate speed. And I remember the great sage Doc Milan said, if you had to turn the tiller, which turns the nose wheel, for maximum deflection, if you were going faster than 11 knots, the wheel just scrapes. So you had to watch your speed all the time, but not ride on the brakes. You'd let it accelerate to maybe 20 knots, slow it down to 10 knots, and let it carry on and accelerate. Otherwise, you overheat the brakes. Or 60.
When you were taking off, let's say on a non-stop flight to London or Frankfurt, you were full of fuel, full of passengers, you were going to go around the bulge, you were going to be airborne for about 13 hours. What sort of speeds would you have in terms of the V1 and rotate?
Okay, I think the highest V1s we had were around about 160 knots. Then your rotate might be at 180 knots. We would get airborne at about 190 knots. Now, if you put that into, that's 350 kilometers an hour, more or less. We had a tire limitation. The tire limitation was 225 miles an hour. It was miles an hour because it came from America, the beautiful. So 190 knots, 225.
195. Yeah.
Sorry, 195 is 225 miles an hour. So you would be right at the limit of the tires. And the limit was, if you went over that limit, the tread would come off it from the centrifugal force. And it was something that you had to contend with. And also because of the weight of the aircraft, it had a taxi limit at max weight of 5 miles that you could. And if you take it to the end of the runway at or Tambo now, that was about 3 miles already, and then you still got your takeoff run. It's quite something, and but still, it was a beautiful, beautiful airplane to fly. And as I've said so many times, I really miss it.
And Karl, you were flying 12, 13-hour sectors through the middle of the night. What did you do for rest? How did you get your rest?
It was initially in the classics, which were the 747s up until the 747-400. The classics had a crew rest at the back. A spiral staircase. I remember when we were with one of the captains, Hinton Banfield Horsecraft, we were in Lisbon and we were having a drink, and he got up and he was walking in circles. So I said, "Captain, something wrong?" He said, "No, he's practicing for the spiral staircase to get upstairs." And so when you went up the stairs, the upper deck was actually designed as a lounge, as a dining room lounge for the first class section, which eventually they put passengers there. And so when you came up the stairs, you had a galley, which was to serve, it was a cocktail bar, to serve maybe 12, 15 people, and then into the flight deck. And opposite the, and there was a toilet there, which was used by the passengers and the crew. And opposite that, there was a little room that had a cross bed and a lengthy bed, and that was the crew rest. It was not a bad arrangement until later as the aircraft developed, how like in the 400 it was just so wonderful because long range.
If I remember correctly, we were facing sanctions. It was difficult to get from here to there without going via Marabastad or going around the Bulge or wherever. And what came onto the scene then was another model of Boeing 747, and that was the Boeing 747 SP. And I think that was designed for ultra long range flights. And could you tell us a little bit about that aeroplane, please?
Yeah, when Boeing, we were being really seriously sanctioned out of Africa. We had nowhere to go. And there were a couple of people, us, Braniff, Iran Air, and these airplanes, Boeing said they can take off from any airport and land at any other airport in the world. And to prove that, on a delivery flight, they took off from Seattle and flew non-stop to Cape Town. And when they got to Cape Town, they still had enough fuel to divert to Durban, up the coast again. They shortened the airplane by 60 feet. And of course, because now it's got a shorter fuselage, a shorter moment arm for the rudder, they lengthened the rudder so it was now 65 feet above the ground. An enormous, long, thin thing. And they tried to design the aircraft so that it would handle the same as the Classic, which it didn't really, but all the systems seemed to work the same. But the airplane was made a lot lighter, probably another 80 tons lighter. Yeah, it was 80 tons lighter than the 747 Classic. Now, we at Joburg at 5,500 feet, and they said we can take off at max weight up to 29 degrees Celsius outside air temperature. And to do this, well, it's impossible. The runway is just not long enough to accommodate that. So they had to boost the power of the engines. And the way they did that is that we had 4 tons of water on board, and that was water injection, demineralized water, and pumps to run that water, which was all used in takeoff up to about 800 feet, I think it was. And the 4 tons of water, okay, so it's 4,000 liters of water in that would be pumped through those engines to cool them. And in cooling it, they could add more fuel and extract more energy out of the, to increase the thrust. And it was quite unique. And I understand that that was one of the features that made the airplanes, convinced our people to buy them, is that we could go with water injection, which I also put on some of the other airplanes as well.
And if I remember correctly, as an additional precautionary measure, just to make absolutely certain that we'd be able to reach all over the world with these aeroplanes, they built that incredibly long runway at Uppington. Is that correct?
Yeah, that came about because the world was closing in on us.
Correct.
And we were using Las Palmas as a stop or as a phone call, and then that started closing on us. And then when we were operating through Luanda, and one of our airplanes was, I happened to be on the ground and saw this happening. It was shot at by, it was Jonas Savimbi's people actually, who were not indisposed to us, because Air Portugal aircraft 747, they had 2, was inbound, but it was 4 hours late, with Agostinho Neto, who became the first president on board. And our airplane arrived there on time, and we were driving out into the airfield, and suddenly it looked like I'd never seen tracer, red tracer, and it was all over the sky, all around this aircraft on final approach, with all the blooming lights on. So, it was a good target for them. Then they were also firing RPGs at this aircraft. It was holed something like 18 times. And it got a 20 mil shell through the auxiliary tank, the outboard auxiliary tank. In Luanda, we used to put in JP4, which is basically petrol fuel, but out of here we use JP1, and which is almost pure kerosene. So it didn't have a high or low flash point. And this thing went through this auxiliary tank right through, and if there was fuel in there, that airplane would have exploded, and it would have just been a mist. That was a serious damage. There was a few small arms fire that went through the fuselage, and only one wheel was, the tread came off it was deflated by a bullet that hit it. And that was the actual start of the violence, or the armed insurrection, or whatever you care to call it, in Angola. And that afternoon we were down at there's a place we used to go for lunch, and there was a shooting star there in a park. And I got into this thing, and a flight engineer slammed the canopy on me when I was inside. I was hot as anything, and I was stuck in this. But at the same time, he grazed the skin off my hand. So I can claim to be the first guy hurt by a military aircraft in Angola.
Karl,
Anyway.
up until this point, you've been a co-pilot.
Yeah.
And you then got your first command in South African Airways, and that was on the 737-100 and 737-200, and they were affectionately known as Fluffies. So could you tell us about your command?
Yes, we only had 200s, but it was called the 200 Basic. They only made a couple of the 100, which are slightly shorter. And that was actually a pocket rocket. It was a very hot airplane, being a twin, whereas, with the 727, you had 3 engines, so it wasn't that critical if you lost an engine. So the 737 was a very high-powered airplane. And it was quite a handful, and that generally became the first domestic aircraft or the domestic jet that a boy pilot would move on to and then move up the line. And it was quite a handful to fly. You know, we had on final approach at East London, there was a flock of hardy, there was swampy ground at the threshold of runway 28. And as we flared, or I flared and throttled back, a flock of hardy-dars flew up, and we must have hit about 10 of them, and a couple went through one of the engines. And it took the fan blades and really damaged the flaps. It really hurt that airplane. Anyway, we cut the engine, because when you ingest a bird, it goes in, and the compressed air, it goes into the cabin, and it's a dreadful smell. Anyway, we get back to the terminal, and it's just normal and most unfortunate. And then the guys have a look at it, and they said, well, this is going to be a delay. The hostess said to me, you know, I don't like these nasty little airplanes. You call them fluff, fat little ugly fellows. And so I said, why not? So she said, because when they break, I said, miss, we'll put you on the train back to Joburg. We'll put you on second class. If you're not happy to fly on these airplanes, it's fine by us. We've got enough to contend with. I said, what makes you say that? He says, because I know these airplanes, you've got to, when they break, you've got to wait for spares to come from Hamleys in London, which is a toy shop. She married one of our captains later, Lynn. It was quite an introduction, and on the 737, we didn't have the range that the 727 had. I wanted to go to 727s, and Bill van Reenen said, you are going to 737s. Yes, sir. But I enjoyed that.
The thing is, there was no flight engineer, so the workload was a hell of a lot higher, but there was also a higher degree of automation. But one of the things that was difficult that the pilots found, those that had flown 727s coming to the 737, that you had greater thrust asymmetry in the event of an engine failure because of the longer moment arm, and it was trickier to control. But it was on the 737 one dark and stormy night that something happened, and you came to the rescue, and eventually you were awarded with Pilot of the Year for your part in preventing what would have been a catastrophe. Could you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, there it was. We had done a 5-leg trip, myself and Mike Maton, and we landed at Joburg, and we got to ops and signing the paperwork, and they said to us, there's a 707 broken down in Durban, and it needs a rudder actuator. Would you guys take it down? Said, what is actually the question? Of course we would. And we put in enough gas to get to Durban and back, and they put this box in with the actuator, and we flew down to Durban and heard the air traffic controller getting a little flustered with this guy flying a thing, a Sia spaghetti, a Sia Machetti. And he said, you are pointing at Umtata, that's the capital of the Transkei. You must turn right. So the guy turns right, and he says, now you're pointing at Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. And he said, eventually he said, all I can tell you to do is find the road and follow to Joburg. Cheapers. And we listened to this lot and went on to the tower frequency and said, please just, cool it with that guy. We'll just drop our load and we'll come back and we'll try and guide him back on another frequency. So we landed, passed the stuff out of the window, and the technicians were very anxious because they hadn't signed the book off, but we hadn't switched the engines off. Put it in a bucket, and we took off, and we set sail to the place where they'd last seen him, which was just slightly to the northeast of Ladysmith. They had a PPI radar, which all it does is give you blips. It doesn't tell you any other information. And they guided us to that position, and then we started calling the sky. We're sitting at about 18,000 feet, where the airplane is drinking fuel, and called this guy and called him. And the third time we called him, he said, I can hear you. And then we said, right, we are going to turn our lights on. We turned all our lights on. And can you describe where you are? And in those days, there was very little population or, built up areas. And he couldn't tell us. He had no idea. And turned the lights on. He said, yes, I can see you. I can see you. So I said, right, just watch us for a moment and just tell us, are we coming towards you? He said, no, I can't see. And right then I saw in front of us, I just saw a little, his beacon light, a red light. And so we said, we've got you in sight.
Sorry, what height were you at?
We were at 18,000 feet.
Okay, and he would have been at 10 or 11?
Yeah, he was at, I think he was at 8.5.
Okay.
So we said to him, no, this is all on Durban's frequency. There was no other traffic around. I said to him, can you climb up? Just climb up, find a light in front of you, straight in front of you, and climb up as high as you can. And we came down to 14,000 feet and saw him and did an orbit, and then slowed down, put the flaps out, came over him at 150 knots, which is really slow for those airplanes. And of course, now you need a lot of power. And said, we are coming over the top of you, and turned on all the landing lights and the cabin lights and everything. And I said, we're over the top of you. Can you see us? Yes, yes, I can see you. So I said, we're turning towards Joburg. And we turned and pointing at Joburg. And I said, just turn and follow us. Just keep on that direction and tell us when you can't see us anymore. I said, what is your compass reading? And he gave us a figure. It was something that was like 050. We were actually steering 330. So I said, make your DI steer 330. I've lost you, I've lost you. So just look for a light in front of you, follow it. And we went, did the orbit, went over him again. They said, right, we are overhead again. Watch us. Right, are you at 33, pointing on 33 on your compass? Yes. And just follow us, and we're slowing down. And now I'm getting a bit nervous about the fuel situation. We didn't have fancy computers, but going on time and, the rate of burn. And then he lost us again. And we went back a third time over this bloke and said, right, we're overhead now. And at that stage, I could just see a pink light, which was the flame at Secunda. And I said, can you see that there light in front of us, way in the distance, a sort of a pink color? Yes, he can see it. I said, that is Secunda, Sasol at Secunda. Just fly towards that. And when you get closer, Joburg will speak to you and help you. And then we left and we went and landed with just a smell of an oil rag in the tanks. Anyway, he made it to Lanseria. And we just, I just wrote in the report that we had turned around because of this guy, an emergency. And we were just fortunate to have been in that position. Anyway, made it to Lanseria. And I met the three brothers who were passengers in that aircraft. And he said that he landed, he tried to land, but he banged it into the ground that the airplane flew again. And he said, so he tried to fly away and the engine stopped. And he landed in the veld, right in Lanseria. And you know how undulating the ground is at Lanseria. And he said they had to walk about nearly a mile to the terminal. Anyway, the guy survived, and that was the end of the story for us. And I heard that 2 weeks later, he rented a Cessna 210. The guy had a total of 60 hours, and he was actually doing a charter in that Siamaketi. It was actually to a rugby match, first rugby match that Argentina played in Durban. And that same guy went to Sun City in a 210 that came out of Krugersdorp, went there in the early evening. And when the people were finished gambling, they get back into the airplane. Now he's taking off. And here comes something that people must know about, the black hole syndrome. And as he took off, you've got no peripheral vision. And so you have no idea where the horizon is. And as you all know out there, that if you are, your mind tells you what the airplane is doing, and it's almost impossible to work out which way is up or down. And he just took off, and the DCA at the time, Jock Hammersays, told me that they just vaguely got a bit of it on a tape back in Joburg of the guy screaming, "Please help me." And he grabbed the microphone and he took off, and he just went over on his back, bang, into the ground. And he killed 5 people and himself, and the end of the airplane. And, but the rescue resulted at the end of the year in this award that you can see behind me from Commercial
Move your head there so that everybody can just have a look at it, please, Karl. The other way. Okay. Very good. Okay, there it is, everybody. Pilot of the Year in recognition of what he's just achieved. Well done. Well done. Well done, Karl.
Yeah, but we were lucky to have been there, Scully. There was no heroics.
But still, you know, as I said, you put people at their ease. You know, I mean, somebody else would have said, "You damn silly fool, what are you doing up here?" You know, and that would have been tickets for the guy. So anyway, from 737s, you went back onto the classic 747 as the commander. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a hell of a lot more decision-making to make. You're the guy that carries the can, and you've got 300 plus people in the back, and you're flying into Europe, into in the European winter with fog and low visibility operations. And could you tell us something about the all-weather capability of the 747 when you were flying into Europe?
Okay, that just this, when they gave me this award there, I saw the main mono of SAA were at this cocktail party at the Wanderers. And the pipe pinner said to me that they are going to put me onto 747s because the airline has got such publicity out of this lot. So I bypassed a whole lot of people, and that put me onto a 747 as a captain at 38 and 37. And now my first trip going off to Europe, now the 747 could land in category 3, which means that you've got 75, you don't have a decision height on your descent, you have 75 meters touchdown zone visibility, and that's measured by a transmissiometer, which is a strobe, etc., and a carpet of lights. And you would come down with auto flight system. It's a very complex business to do an auto landing to that accuracy. But it is the most absolutely incredible sensation that you could ever have in an airliner. And I reckon I was able to do 7 of those. I never did a very bad visibility takeoff. I did one with maybe 300 meters visibility, but not the 75 meters, which we could use. But now, because we had to fly around the bulge on my very first trip, it was to Lisbon, which I eventually went to 76 times while I was in the airline. But anyway, descending into Lisbon, and you don't have the facilities that we have nowadays. Your navigation was very accurate, and we'd get weather on HF, high frequency. So when somebody said, "Where did you learn to speak English?" and the guy said, "On the BBC, on shortwave." Anyway, that was how we used to listen to it. And we get the weather at Las Palmas. The station there, we could hear what Lisbon was. And the next one was from Funchal, Rosario Point. And we get the weather. It was all okay. And eventually, now we got no fuel. It's 11 and a half hours around the bulge to Lisbon, and about 50 cigarettes, which I regret to have smoked. And on the descent, everything is working out fine. We've got the weather, And we get to 17,000 feet and they switch us over to approach. And the approach controller comes back and he says, Springbok, state your intention. So we said, we're inbound to Lisbon. So he said, be advised, visibility less than 50 meter. Now, on the first flight, there's just so much to handle on the airplane. And this, as we recognize, is where you hit a pump, meaning a point of maximum pucker. So at 17,000 feet, and we'd listened to the weather around the place, and we turned around, we turned on a descent and just turned right to Faro, which was down the south of Portugal, and descended, still descending all the way, and landed there uneventfully. But, you know, it was totally unfamiliar. And in the airline, you had to have been to a place first before you could go there as a captain. And anyway, it was to make it safe. So we land at Faro, and we get to the end of the runway, and the whole place is full of aeroplanes. We turn off the runway on the taxiway. That's where we stopped, because there is nowhere to park. And we've got 6,000 kilograms of fuel. Now, if you, as Scully said earlier, that if you remember that you've got 180 tons of fuel on the aircraft, you've only got 6 left. It's a number, it's a proportion. The fuel consumption during a go-around, at go-around thrust, is 28,000 kilograms an hour. So we've got 6 tons left. Man, you can't even wipe it with a rag inside the tanks. There's so little fuel. And only then, after you know, everything's settled down, there was nothing dangerous about it, but we had no reserves. We had diverted. Then you realize the fatigue sets in, because you've taken a shock, but nobody's got hurt. And they bust us up to Lisbon, and they bust the crew down from Lisbon to Faro, and then they pushed off to Rome and Athens, wherever.
Karl, you said that you did about 7 of these approaches, these ultra low visibility approaches, where you had between 70 and 100 meters of what we call runway visual range. Now you fly these approaches with the autopilot engaged. But could you just explain to everybody what an automatic approach entails, and the number of autopilots you actually use, and what these autopilots are doing when you set up for an automatic landing?
I'd just like to point out to everybody listening in that Scully was a training captain in the airline, and he was also very responsible for my personal confidence in doing these approaches. We practiced them in the simulator. The airplane knew where the runway was. And anyway, you had ILSs. We had 3 ILSs. They were in the nose, where the antenna were in the nose. And when you put the gear down, because you must remember the 747 is approaching in that sort of attitude. So the nose is not exactly in the glide path. The gear is in the glide path. So you put the gear down, and the antenna switches from the nose to antenna on the gear doors to be able to give you a very accurate glide slope, and also the azimuth. And the co-pilot would actually be the handling pilot, and you put the gear out just before about 1,500 feet, a few hundred feet above the outer market, 4 miles. And he would actually be hands and feet on the control column, and his other hand on the throttles, thrust levers. And throttles are these things around your neck. Anyway, and as a captain, now you've got a set of annunciator lights that come on in sequence. and the auto flight system annunciators must be come on in the correct sequence. Very complex, and all of them, the autopilots all get their power from different sources, their radio information from different sources, and they all check each other. And if one is not in agreement, it cams out, gives you a red light. Anyway, so now the co-pilot is flying the airplane on instruments, and he's watching everything and making sure that the speeds are exactly right. Of course, you brief heavily beforehand, or very thoroughly, I should say. And when you get to 500 feet, the captain puts his right hand onto the thrust levers, and you push juniors out of the way. And you sit there, and you are now following it. When you get to 100 feet, he says, which comes with radio altimeter, which is very accurate, and says 100, and you say landing, because you're committed, which has been briefed. Landing, so you still can't see a damn thing in front of you. And the airplane gets to, at 53 feet gear height, it starts at nominal 53 feet, it goes into an automatic flare. And when it carries on down to 12 feet, it switches from the ILS glide slope onto, not the glide slope, the approach path. It switches onto the antenna at the end of the runway. And that is now, we call it the paint sniffer, because now it's also steering it to keep the airplane in the middle. It smells the paint. It smells the paint of the center line, and it puts the nose wheel on either side of the center line. And sometimes it even puts it down. I think we only had about a 10 knot maximum crosswind limit, and under those conditions, and it puts it down like melting ice. It's absolutely the most glorious airplane. And then you still go and park the thing, and you've got lights guiding you for your close-in parking at the terminal. You put that airplane within 1 or 2 millimeters of where it should be, and you've come from 11 hours ago. What a fantastic machine, which is an everyday occurrence nowadays.
Karl, that was a terrific explanation. And now, everyone, you can see why I said he was a great instructor. He has a knack for getting things across to everybody. That really was terrific.
Wait, you are not taking accolades yourself, which you
no, please. But in any event,
taught us, and he hammered us on the type of lighting system that you'd see and what lights you'd see in various category landings, and you would understand, instead of just seeing this maze of lights in front of you, that they had a specific purpose, and they had to be done like that wherever you went. And it was a standard operation for us. And thanks to Scully for that too.
Thanks for that, Karl. We're rapidly ending our this interview. We're running out of time over here. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to discuss Karl's time on the 747-400. Okay, Karl, so you went on to the 747-400, and this was actually a quantum leap ahead. It looks like the 747 Classic, but it certainly isn't.
The 747, you could see by those winglets. And that was basically a two-man operation, and the cabin crew said that the winglets and the Classic had a flight engineer, and the cabin crew used to say the winglets at the end were for cheers engineers. Sadly, the vital third men. They were terrific friends of mine, and fount of knowledge, every single one of them, and they made life very easy for us. So now you come on the 747s, the 747-400, that is so largely automated, and everything is overhead, and you've got the most beautiful computerized systems. And as one American said, he says, you know, that 400, I don't fly too good, but at least I types 40 words a minute. And we could fly that airplane from from New York to Johannesburg non-stop, Miami to Cape Town non-stop. It was just the most delicious airplane to fly. And I've told so many of my friends that I miss it so badly that every now and then, now it's nearly 18 years since I was put out to pasture, and I still occasionally get into the cupboard with a vacuum cleaner running, so that my clothes cupboard, of course, so that I can pretend I'm in the crew rest. And you know, to make it even more realistic, is that my wife comes along and bangs around there every 2 hours and gives me some cold tea. And then I really feel like I'm back in the crew rest of the 400. It was wonderful. And I've mentioned earlier about the layout of the, you know, we spoke about the galley and the crew rest. The 747, when you went through a bomb-proof door that weighed 480 kilograms, that was after 9/11, you had 2 first-class seats so that you weren't always sitting in behind with a control column. And if you carried additional crew, that's where they were able to eat. And you had a crew rest on the side that had a bed with, or it was double bunks. The lower bed had a heat control and its own music channel. It was beautiful. And the upper bunk didn't have that facility. And I remember one of the guys saying, he only sleeps on the top bunk because it's only his gardener that sleeps on the floor. Really a wonderful airplane. And it just everything in that airplane, it gave you such confidence. And the fact that the airline trusted you with the airplane. Now, this is 18 years ago. That one behind us there, Ibai, that was taken to Port Elizabeth for its naming ceremony. They cost 2.4 billion rand in those days, 2.4 billion. And if you consider that, it wouldn't fit into this enormous room that I'm in here if in 200 rand notes. It is just such a lot of money. And we had those airplanes, we never bent them, we never scratched them. The airline would say, okay, take this airplane to New York or Dallas or wherever, Houston. And they didn't even say to us, don't scratch it. You know, fly it properly and don't use fuel, etc. And, you know, it ends up with learning more about the weather and how to use the weather and how to use the altitudes, the optimum altitudes of the aircraft. It was just absolutely fantastic. We actually had 2 pilots and at times up to 23 crew on board. We'd have 212,000 liters of fuel and 6.5 tons of catering equipment in the airplane. It was a phenomenal machine.
The Flying Palace. And along the way, you broke a couple of records in this aeroplane, speed records.
Yeah, it wasn't my intention to do that.
It never is, but when it's happening, it happens. Yeah.
We departed Miami at normal cruise speeds, the flight plan cruise speed, and we picked up a terrific tailwind. And it was the only flight, the only day when we operated from Cape Town to Miami, that the Cape Town to Miami flight couldn't get there non-stop. It had to go via Ilha de Sol. And we were going the opposite direction, and consequently we had this wonderful, wonderful tailwind. And on final approach, there was a guy from Die Bild, a reporter from Die Bild, and he said when we landed, he said, Kaptein, ons is seker baie tyd opgemaak. So I said, yeah, something like about an hour and a quarter. He said, it moet 'n record wees. So I got the printout from the ACARS, and I gave it to Aero Club and applied to have this registered. And there behind me is the world speed record, which over 6,500 kilometers. It was my good fortune to be there. And I've got this lovely conversation piece. And Johan, our chief pilot, said, hey, I wish you didn't do this because other people are going to try and beat you and use too much fuel.
Karl, I know we're wearing your left buttock out, but just move over again onto your side, please, so everybody can read you. There you go. That's it. That's that was the record that Karl said. Thanks. You can come back now.
Oh, thanks.
Right now, this 747-400. I think, to my knowledge, there are very few aeroplanes that carry fuel in the stabilizer as well, and
Yes.
that also differentiated it greatly from the 747 Classic. The fact that you could put fuel in the tail.
We had 12,000 liters of fuel in the stabilizer tanks, and we had 80 tons, 80,000 kilograms in the center tank. So if you took off and you couldn't get the fuel out of the stabilizer tanks, you now got a center of gravity problem. It would drain at a certain rate, but usually not fast enough to empty it on a long flight. So on takeoff, you take off with tank to engine, and with all the pumps on, including in the stabilizer, you get airborne, and you would reduce the pressure of the wing tanks to get the fuel out, which you are now using out of the center tank, to make enough room for the stabilizer fuel to flow into the center tank. And then you'd use the center tank first, and that would prevent the airplane from the wings from flexing, and it would prolong the life of the wings. So you would use that center tank fuel first and allow the stabilizer fuel to flow into the center tank, and eventually you'd use the fuel inboard and more inboard, and eventually the stuff on the outboard, to keep the wing as strong as possible.
So fuel management was critical on the aeroplane, both from a wing bending moment point of view and also from a longitudinal stability point of view.
We had a recommended limit of a 4-ton differential on the the longitudinal weight. Sorry, that would be the lateral weight.
Lateral.
And but at 4 tons, that airplane didn't know what it was.
I think it was nominal only. Yeah. Okay. So now, any moment now, we're going to take a couple of questions, because, as I said, very regrettably, we're running out of time. But just tell us about remember that the airplane had what they called a supercritical wing. And here you have this huge, monstrous airplane. And was this a lumbering beast, or was this fast in its own right?
It was like a ballerina. It was just such a beautiful airplane to fly. It was so sensitive. It flew like a fighter, but like, I should imagine, I haven't had a Rolls Royce for some while now, but I should imagine it went like a Rolls Royce would drive. It was the most wonderful, wonderful airplane to fly. And I wonder if they'll ever make anything that'll be as pleasant to fly as this. And I'm so grateful and so fortunate that I had the good fortune to be able to fly them. And also to the airline for the training that you guys gave us, that we were so competent because of the constant training and, of course, the constant supervision. And for a while, I was a check captain on the airplane, and I found very little variance between the crews that I checked. And now and then there were a bit of a skeleton, but we caught up with him.
Just before I give you some very special news, what I was after was the speed that you could cruise this aeroplane at. And whereas the 727 cruised around at 0.82, the 737 at 0.78, this one we used to start off at, when we were heavy, at Mach 0.86. Yeah, this was no slow coach. This airplane was really very fast. Standard cruise was 0.86, and on test flights I know that I took it to 0.92, which is to test the overspeed warning. It was one hell of an aeroplane. And now the special piece of news is that there was a flash over here from your son, Wayne, who is a pilot with Emirates, and he says that he agrees with you that the 747 is the greatest aeroplane ever built.
Oh, thanks, Wayne. Oh, that is lovely. Gee, thanks, that's Scully. That's really nice. You've just made this evening go past in a flash.
And I think it's time for you to answer some questions now.
Okay, the riskiest part was in the crew transport. I've been in no less than 7 crew transport accidents. The one, I think the most devastating was at Ilha de Sol. We had a regular little bus that would take about 25 people, and the other one with wings on the side like a 55 Chev, and that was known as the Batmobile. Anyway, it was the airport in Santa Maria where we stayed, Santa Mari where we stayed, was 17 kilometers away. Now, totally, there's nothing, even the telephone lines lay on the ground. There weren't even phone poles. And there was at one place where the occasional rain that the road had been built up. And when the 2 vehicles passed, the one guy went with his wheel, it just went off the tar, and it rolled down the side. Oh, dear, dear, dear. I was a co-pilot then, and that's the captain fell across the bus, and he broke 3 ribs on his back. And Basil Graham, dear guy. So he was put on the airplane and taken to London, and I had to stay there, and there was a Czech crew going Otto Grede, going through to London. So I had to stay there for another 3 days at Seoul for the next flight. And I was a smoker, and my cigarettes had run out. It was hell. Anyway, we also had a bad prang in Lisbon, where they had some old gas guzzlers about 1955, 1960 American tanks. And we were in this one Buick. And this guy was going like smoke, and a Lisbon taxi went across his path, and he T-boned this motor car, and it flung it to the other side. And our car, we felt a bit of a bump. The Merc was absolutely wrecked. That was one. Another one in Rio. We used to say we gonorrhea on Tuesday, and we come back with diarrhea on Thursday. But we were also in a combi there going in from the Galeão airport, and we were staying on a Copacabana. It's not quite as romantic as people make out, have you know. And there seems to be a lot of military activity around there in those days all the time. And there was a roadblock with machine gun nests on either side of the road and soldiers in the road stopping us. And the guy just rode, and he put on his hooter, and he just rode through the slot. And I thought, man, we are going to be shot at. They never shot at us. And the next day, we were going in a bus, John Tainton, to Petropolis, where Santos Dumont came from. And the bus collided with another bus, and he didn't even stop. It took half the side of the bus off. And we were, that was going there. And when we came back, we were in another one where a truck came along, and it clipped the side of us, took the side of the bus off. Man, it was bad news. We were in a prank in London. I can go on and on. Had a little stowaway, not a stow, he stowed away on boats and eventually ended up in Sweden, and via Cape Town got a forged passport. And he got to Sweden, they said no more. He's got this Namibian passport, and they put him on our airplane in London. And this guy had 2 Swedish guards with him, and they put him in the back. And of course, the guards are going on this wonderful jolly with this little short Arab fellow. And the cabin crew come around, and they said, some wine? Yeah, I'll have red wine. He says he wants a bottle. They gave him a bottle of wine, and he was zonked with khat, that leaf. He went berserk in the back of the airplane. And eventually we had 8 guys holding him down. The co-pilot went along, and we had a certain weaponry and security equipment. And he says, don't worry, I'll go along, I'll sort him out. He said, I'll give him one crack. And it would have broken his head, because this guy was a big fella. He said, don't hurt him, please don't hurt him. And eventually, after about 15 minutes of him being the co-pilot being away, now we're flying over Africa, and I think it was the second or the third night that we'd been allowed to fly over Africa direct. And we get past Algiers, and this bloke is screaming like a stuck pig at the back, and they're hurting him. And eventually he was subdued with handcuffs and and cable ties. But you cannot tie somebody to the structure in landing in case you have to evacuate. We get to Joburg, and I remember from the Hildeberg that the guy said, we've got smoke in the cockpit. If they could have told them, said, we've got smoke in the cockpit from a fire in the cargo or something like that, would have helped. So every half an hour, I was giving a report to our radio station, ZUR at Joburg. And we get, and asking for police assistance when we land. And we get there, 7:10, no cops. So get hold of ops and say, what happened to the cops? Hang on with your phone and find out. They said, oh no, they changed shift at 7 o'clock and they never passed on. Anyway, a couple of minutes later, a whole bunch of yellow cop vans arrived, and this little fellow policeman in fatigues, he's got nothing, he's just in his uniform. I don't see he's got handcuffs or anything like that. Hair standing up like this, like a freshly shagged rabbit. And he comes charging up the stairs, and I said, hey, meneer, baas jou boeie, where are your handcuffs? He said, no, ek ken hierdie mense. And he walked up, and I watched this bloke. I said, you're not taking our handcuffs off. And he walked up to this guy, and he clouted him across the side of the face. But what the stuff from his, anyway, it was one, and then this guy got a script, and now he's calm. He's realized he's in trouble, because these guys are not taking nonsense. They put him in jail, and that afternoon they put him on an Airbus and took him to Windhoek. That was a terrible, terrible, terrible passenger experience, because it went on for about 8 hours. And the screaming of this guy and his language, and so scared that he'd hurt somebody, we damage the airplane, damage a window, depressurize. What do? Do you turn around and go back to London? Do you carry on to Joburg? It's 4.5 hours to London, and it's 6.5 hours to Joburg. And we pressed on home, where we knew we'd have assistance. I'll just cry, guy. Devastated at our wonderful airline that was so profitable, that gave us such a wonderful existence. It was such a flagship for the country. It was unreal. And what has happened now, I just can't believe that we are stooping so low. I am so, so sad. That's my sentence. Good luck, but to an aspirant pilot with a PPL, now it's going to take you a couple of years to get to a point where you've got a senior comm. And my view is that, like good things, bad things, all things pass, and the COVID will pass. And I do believe that there are so many thousands of airplanes that are just worth so much money, and they are not going to be allowed to just rot away. They're going to be put back into service. And the people that have been put out to pasture now, it's going to be, I think, about my own view, not a very expert view, about another 2 years before we get back into aviation. And there is going to be such a shortage of pilots. So a young person, Craig, going into aviation is doing the right thing now. there cannot be a better career than being an airline pilot. There are the other careers, of course, but nothing like being an airline pilot. Old Rhinebeck is about 100 miles north of New York, next to the Hudson River. Beautiful area. And Karl had Old Rhinebeck Airfield, and he had something like 70 World War I era aircraft, and before that. And May through September, every Sunday, they would have put on a pantomime with these beautiful old airplanes, and it would be the good guys and the bad guys against each other, and always trying to steal the kiss from whatever, Katie was her name, I think. And we would drive up, and in those days in New York, you could only get beer at 12 o'clock, the Grand Union, the Grand Onion supermarket in Old Rhinebeck. Oldest hotel in the world is at least in America, is at Old Rhinebeck. And next to the place is a little stream, and we would stop there and we would buy a disposable braai. For the first 3 or 4 times, I thought, no, hang on, this costs a lot of money. And I made a braai grid at home, and I took it with me. And they kept it in the baggage room at the hotel that we stayed at. And eventually, the guy didn't like this thing coming back greasy, so I went and hung it in a tree, just maybe 50 meters off the little road in the stream where we had our lunchtime braai and beer. And every time I went back, go and get the braai out of the tree. And my son went there a little while ago, and he didn't know the tree, but he remembered the braai, but went to go and look for it. And I guarantee that braai grid is still in the tree there. I went there a total of 16 times. I always dragged the crew there screaming, and boy, it was what an experience. It was really nice.
Every time he goes on board, it's funny.
One of the guy taking off in an Airbus in a terrible crosswind at night, and it's raining, and it's all in limits, and they go charging down the runway, and of course there's airplanes all over the runway in this wind, and the flight engineer, who had a heavy French accent, and they get to V1 and he says, burning, burning, burning. And the captain's closes asleep. Oh, gee, and he opens it, and they get airborne, they turn out, and they're on their way, and he turns around and says, okay, what was burning? He said, no, it was a little Bernie that I saw. Okay, thank you everybody who has actually waded through this evening with us. It's a real honor for me to have been here and been invited.
Karl, thank you. It appears as if that was the last question, and I know that there's a curfew on, and I know that unfortunately there's a time constraint. So, Karl, what we have to say is that I certainly, knowing you very well, but I heard stories that I hadn't heard before, and also I'm very, very impressed with your technical and your operational knowledge, even though you are very, very Madala. Well done. We can all learn by the things you know and that you're prepared to pass on. I have to say that you've had a stellar career. You've flown from the smallest to the biggest. We haven't been able to talk about your involvement in the DC-3 and the Ju-52, both of which you flew and enjoyed very much, and you contributed a lot to the historical flight. You're passionate and committed to aviation, and it has been a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you tonight. But now we've still got 2 minutes. And okay, without mentioning names, well, you can mention perhaps 2 out of the 3 names. there was a situation when the guys were busy with the before takeoff checklist. They all stuttered and they got takeoff clearance. Tell us about that.
No, I'd rather tell you about the flight engineer who spoke with a, but he was an excellent flight engineer. And I actually did some training with him, and he got a comm license, but he was too old to get into the airline. And this fellow was, or let's call him Ernie. And Ernie always used to say to me, you know, he was such a lovely character, and he would joke about his stuttering, and he'd always say to me, Engelsman, vir jou gaan ek gemoer. And anyway, he said that when he couldn't get into the airline as a pilot, he said that he's going to go for an interview, and see him a couple of months later and said, did you go for the interview? He said, yeah, he went to the ABC. So he said, for an interview? Yeah, of course. So what was it for? He said, I wanted to be a newsreader. So I said, well, what was the result? He said, no, they said I'm too tall.
Thanks for that, Karl. And to all of you that tuned in tonight, once again, thank you very, very much.